Welcome to Impact Unicorns, the podcast where you meet inspirational entrepreneurs building the next generation of transformative companies. And now, here is your host, Dr. Indranil Ghosh, award-winning author, investor, and advisor to global leaders.
Welcome to this week's episode of Impact Unicorns. I'm your host, Indranil Ghosh, and today I'm excited to welcome Bhupinder Bhullar to the show. Bhupinder has a distinguished career in genomic research at the Harvard Medical School, the Whitehead Institute, and Novartis Institute for Biomedical Research. Bhupinder's explorations in genomic drug development brought him face to face with the challenge of storing and analyzing vast amounts of data. And Bhupinder uncovered opportunities to improve the data storage and informatics side of his discipline. And he realized that applying those insights to improve data center efficiency more broadly could produce a billion-dollar business. And so Swiss Vault was born. And in 5 short years, Bhupinder has developed data storage servers that are able to store 14 times more data per unit volume and operate 10 times greater energy efficiency than today's systems. Bhupinder, it's really great to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, and thank you, first of all, for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're recording this on New Year's Eve 2021. So as we go into the bold new future that is 2022, it's really good to start with such an inspiring story, because I think with Swiss Vault, you're really going at the heart of one of the big challenges of our time, which is to address the huge cost of storing increasingly large amounts of data. And Swiss Vault, which is your first venture, seems to be attacking this head on. It's interesting to me when I talk to entrepreneurs to sort of get a little bit of their backstory, because people come to entrepreneurship through many different paths. Some, are sort of born entrepreneurs. It's the only thing they've ever done. Others, like yourself, grow into it after extensive careers, in your case, in research and in large corporate environments. Tell us a little bit about, how your early career in life sciences gradually migrated into this exciting venture that you're taking on right now.
Well, thank you. So basically, it's true. I had a very extensive academic career, and when I started in my academics, I really was sort of aligned to become a professor. And I thought, but I had a chance meeting with one of the very senior Canadian researchers who said, "Be careful what you ask for; you just might get it." And they made sure that I thought carefully about the decisions I made and what I was experiencing. And academia is great. It's great to be under the Ivy Tower, but at the same time, I also wanted to make impact. And I was always looking for ways to take my ideas and build a commercial model so you can realize the impact. So if you have a drug molecule, I was developing a platform when I was in Boston, use yeast as a way to drug discovery, but I didn't know very much about drug discovery, and that's how when I had the opportunity to work at Novartis to learn more about the drug discovery principles, I jumped for it because I realized that this is an opportunity for me to get a vast amounts of knowledge that I don't have and acquire it very quickly, and so that's how that happened. But this is, first of all, this is my first real venture that's gone much further. But I've had other starts where I tried to take ideas and commercialize them. For instance, the very first one was to take this yeast model for drug discovery and commercialize it almost about 15 years ago. And then about 5 years ago, I did try to build another system we call the science publication networks to bring reproducibility to data. We spend vast amounts of taxpayers' money to do research, but there's this kind of ominous problem that's coming up, which is that a lot of it is not reproducible. And so, and that's the underlying principle behind scientific discoveries that become our guiding principles today, is that they're reproducible, and that and we wanted to help the institutions become more reproducible. And so that was in terms of this adventure. that's basically how it jumped up. Is that I was sorry, I'm going to go 3, 2, 1 in the editing. So 3, 2, 1. Basically, in this venture in SwissVault, I was looking for a way to help organizations manage vast amounts of data for genomics. My background is in genomics research. And genomics is one of those things which is your most private data. It's your most private data on this planet. And it also belongs to everyone in your family, and including your future descendants. And we were trying to say, well, if this data gets mismanaged somehow, if it's on somebody else's server, it gets lost, it'll affect future generations. And they may be disadvantaged from getting life insurance. They might be disadvantaged from getting jobs based on information that we learn about in genomics about what impacts their health or maybe future capabilities or something. And so we became very concerned about how this data was being managed. We wanted to give the tools to the organizations and the individuals to be able to manage that data properly.
So you're one of these creative people that clearly gets excited about solving problems in the world. And it seems like you're thinking about your own drug development, but also, your customers, not just the patients, but probably hospitals or other places that are going to be repositories of this very private information. So how did it go from there, which is thinking about their data storage problems and their data privacy issues, to coming up with the idea for SwissVault?
Well, when I saw this data growing, actually, I was leading a program here in Switzerland. It was on bringing people together to leverage this next new emerging technology called DNA sequencing. And DNA sequencing, as it was done in the old ways, took 10 years to sequence one human genome and cost a couple of $1 billion. But by mid 2005, new technologies were coming out, and they became much more accessible by the end of that decade, 2009. And I got my hands on a sequencer in 2009. I was already at Novartis trying to help build drug discovery molecules for various diseases. But I jumped on the opportunity to understand what is the variations that drive cancer drug resistance. Novartis has a lot of drugs for cancer, but we all know that almost invariably they will become resistant to the drugs. So I said, I want to sequence these cancers and figure out what are the mutations that drive this. And everybody said there's way too many mutations, you'll never figure out. But actually, we showed that it will work. In 2009, we showed that we could sequence cancers and build an interesting algorithm, a perfect algorithm that will discern the mutations that are relevant. But by that process, we generated a data that's equivalent to 1 terabyte for a genome, one genome. And that's like 1,000 DVD movies equivalent for one cancer sample. And we were like, wow, how hospitals manage this data? And we never thought about scaling data storage servers would be a big deal at that time. However, the critical turning point came around in 2012 when I had an ex-colleague at the Whitehead Institute at MIT, and he said, I can tell someone's last name just by looking at the DNA sequence. I don't need additional information. And so we were like, that's impossible. But actually, it's a very simple principle. It is that your Y chromosome is passed down from father to son to grandson. And that's also how your last name is passed down. And if you have a little bit of information about Y chromosome, you can follow generations up and down, for hundreds of years. And at that point is where the lightning rod hit, because I was like, well, this is your most private data, but doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everybody else, right? So if somebody uses it, the genome sequencing service, and shares that data, they're exposing just about everybody else in that family tree and future descendants. And that was the lightning rod that hit. And we said, we need to figure out a better solution. And we were looking for something, we never found it. So we made SwissVault to address that.
And this concept of just the explosion of data isn't just in life sciences, it's panning out across industry after industry. So in a way that you are looking at, one use case, one problem, but it had mirror images across the economy. And so it seems like SwissVault is not just solving, the problem for, genomic research, but a whole host of different applications. Tell us a little bit about, this explosion in data, and in fact, how expensive it is and what kind of a toll it takes on the environment, because the stats are actually quite staggering.
Oh, correct. So I think about this last decade, 2015, as machine learning and AI really came into prominence, then it really became a race to collect lots and lots of data. So organizations that had a lot of data would become really efficient in terms of minimizing the cost, discovering new innovations based on very rare interactions with data, and so that's what's fueling the self-driving automobiles or the autonomous drones, for instance. You collect lots of sensor data, and then what happened is that when organizations start collecting a lot of data, you got to put it somewhere. You have to have a physical space, so you need a data center, and data centers are basically massive constructions of concrete and also an energy infrastructure that powers that installation. And then you have to have these servers also that made. Now, this is where the biggest cost is, because these servers are made with precious metals, for instance. That's one component for all the circuits or the CPU chips. And then they're made with lots of parts, moving parts, and they're usually very high cost, and they use a lot of energy as well. So what we saw happening is that there was a massive growth in certain regions of the world where data centers are exploding, and everybody's looking for the next place where they can realize the energy efficiencies. And they were bringing them up to Northern Europe, for instance, where it's much cooler. But that's not always possible, because data, there's a lag issues of data, but also you can't really scale the technology that we have infinitely, because it's a lot of energy and space utilization. And so what we did was we realized that to be able to get to that, you have to solve some of these problems. You have to solve the energy problem, you have to solve the space problem, and you have to solve the ease of use problems, because they're pretty complex right now. And our target focus was always hospitals. We were always looking at hospitals as the location where we would put our data centers. But you're quite right. It became very evident shortly after that every industry was seeing an explosion of data, and that whatever we built for the hospitals actually was relevant across all the other industries.
If you're enjoying Impact Unicorns, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to receive notifications of new shows. Bring the most relevant impact venture stories to the podcast. If you would like to review the show, go to the Apple Podcasts mobile app or iTunes to leave a rating and review.
Hospitals are a very interesting lead customer, if I can call it that, because of the sensitivity of the data. It's not always possible to build the data center in Iceland and assure the hospital that the data is being safely kept in a different jurisdiction. So I imagine that's a factor with many of your potential customers of data centers, the need to have it somewhat local, or at least in the same jurisdiction.
Absolutely correct, because that's where the regulation was going. Genomics England was actually my biggest sort of inspiration for this, after I had a chance meeting with the Secretary of Health in the UK, Jeremy Hunt, at that time. And they said, what we promise is that we promise to keep that data locally. In fact, the Genomics England promised to keep it on a military base with the building surrounded by barbed wire, because they said, if we lose this whole game of the trust of the individuals that we're trying to serve, then we lose the whole ability to build a better healthcare system based on genomics. And so every other country realized that they cannot let this data go outside of their region. So data sovereignty is critical for this situation. I think more and more are realizing this, that especially with the head of the MI6 recently said in this last month that data sovereignty is critical for us, because once other organizations have our data, we lose this sovereignty of our data.
So the contours of the problem were becoming clear. You need to store the data in less space, with less energy, and locally, with a secure, data sovereignty assurance. So how did you go about, from an engineering standpoint, thinking about the problem of reducing the space and reducing the energy requirements to store all this information?
So basically, what happened was that we are not coming from the data industry in particular. We were coming from the outside looking to build a solution. And my co-founder, Doug Fortune, who has 20 years experience at the time in data centers and building data centers or understanding data storage systems, we were looking at the problem from the hospital perspective, how we can help them solve these same issues that you mentioned: space, energy, and ease of use, long-term storage. So we were thinking outside the rack, is now what we like to say it. We were not wedded to the rack. We were thinking outside the rack. And that's how we came upon our design innovation. We said, well, we need to do is store data, and we need to give access to the data. And so we built something that was completely different. I should say by an interesting point is that when you look at data servers, they were initially actually designed in the 1890s. And that was when Morse code was used and being implemented across railway lines, for instance. And they needed a component, it's like a shelf or a server, where they can put all the electronics in. And then when the telecom industry came about, the same people migrated from Morse code to telecom, brought the same design in because it was handy. It was the same, they had a form factor they could use and adapt it to the telecom industry. And then when the telecom industry grew into the data storage industry, they had a form factor, which was the one that we've been using for Morse code. So that's how this form factor became a standard for this industry. But we were coming from the outside. So we designed something that was completely innovative and novel. And by our design, we were able to decrease the space. And that was our first realization that, this can be actually useful for everybody else as well, not just hospitals, because space is an issue everywhere.
And how about the energy? How is it you're bringing down the energy consumption?
Okay, a very good question. So where the industry was going was they were going to higher, faster, stronger. So they wanted to build bigger and bigger chips that could compute really, really lots of data very quickly, right? And so that was what we call the Ferrari of systems, is that, but we were going towards the other side, the Volvos, the reliable, energy efficient systems that could last a long time. And what we were looking for was we were selecting our parts. First of all, we're selecting parts that are low energy consuming. And the second aspect, we realized is that there are ways that we can do this that allow us to do data operations in a more parallelized fashion. If you do one node, you can do one crunching of one data, but then it's kind of sequential. But if you take that data file and you split it up and you get multiple nodes to work on it, you then can make the speed 10 times faster or even 1,000 times faster. And so that's what we from the bottom up, that's how our software is designed to do everything in a massive parallel way. So we can write at 1,000 times faster speed or retrieve data in a faster way. Our software, for instance, takes a data file and just splits it up and distributes it across systems. It can be distributed across a city or distributed across the world. As long as the bandwidth is very fast, you can retrieve the data really quickly and analyze it locally, sort of thing. And so in a parallelized fashion. So we can use very low energy chips and achieve very fast computational rates, just like the high-end performance systems.
I understand. Is it fair to say that you're getting higher utilization of the chips by parallelizing?
Yes, exactly. We're also more energy efficient. So not only bringing data energy efficiency to data storage, but we're bringing energy efficiency to computation, which is the second part of this problem for energy efficiency overall for data. Fascinating.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the evolution of the company, because for our listeners, it's always fascinating to hear how companies grow up. So you've been at this 5 years. Tell us about some of the important milestones that you've gone through and where you are at the moment.
Yeah. So when we started, of course, we started with the principle that we can bootstrap, and we spent 2 years sort of in skunk works, I guess, and we were building our own system. So Doug and I, we felt in our garage, we were building the component parts, assembling them, and I was going around trying to find the customer bases. I did find an early customer, in fact. The health department at the government of Canada wanted to buy about 20 units. And that was about a second year into the project, and it took us about 6 months to get that sale ready. But then we hit upon a very interesting snag, and that is that they have a high procurement wall, the government especially, and so which is very difficult for us to circumvent. So then we said, okay, well, in terms of our journey, we had to register a company and try to figure out how we can get funding. And the very first thing that happened was that the problem that we are working on, which is energy efficient storage, data privacy, is we were able to get grants right away and grants to work on this project. So we've been working on grants since 2018 and awards. When we would pitch at an event, a competition with 200 deep tech startups, we came in first. 50,000 was the prize. When we went to climate tech is one of the interesting emerging programs in European Commission. We went and pitched. There was 1,200 competitors across 40 countries. We came in the top 10 and got a lot of resources to continue developing the company and stuff. So that took off in a direction where we were able to then develop our next generation technologies, just using grant funding and awards.
And over the course of the history of the company, how much funding have you raised just simply through grants and innovation awards?
About 2.4 million.
Well, that's extraordinary. Well, congratulations on that, first of all. But that's a remarkable achievement. And so, tell us a little bit. Now that you've developed the technology, who are the customers that you're courting, and what problems are you solving for them?
Okay. Well, the customer framework that we have now developed as a persona are those customers that are amassing large volumes of data. So this is hospitals, government, and major research institutions like CERN. They're collecting large volumes of data that they need to keep for a very long period of time. So a hospital, for instance, will now, when a baby's born, will build digital records, but want to keep it for 100 years, for instance. And so this is a large bulk of data that has to be accessible. You have to be able to give, it has to be readily accessible. And so we're targeting this kind of customers. They have a massive data volumes. They need to keep it for a very long period of time. They need to decrease their costs, and the data has to be accessible. It can also be banking, for instance. Another organizations is another one that's a good industry segment.
And are you working directly with these businesses because they have their own data centers, or are you also working with outsourced third-party data centers, if I can call it that?
Well, we over the last couple of days, when the last couple of years, when you were asking about our journey, people have been finding out about what we're building, and so we're being approached by a number of different industries, data centers in particular. But in terms of the data centers that we're targeting, all the major hospitals that are leading in terms of digital health typically have their own data center that's very close. So when governments are realizing that they need to keep data more private, so that's also another interesting segment for us. But the large research institutes like CERN have exacting needs for their data storage, and they're distributed among 23 countries. And the data has to be accessible among their partners in these 23 countries. And this actually fits very well with our model. Our data is very highly distributed, and it can be managed remotely as one namespace across the world, for instance, if you wanted to. And so that works really well in our design favor for how we manage data.
And how are you, interacting with your customers in terms of the model? Are you going to be an equipment provider or a solution provider? How does that work?
So basically, what we happen to see is that the customers I mentioned to you, hospitals, governments, and these large research institutions, is that their data is growing year on year. So we just see a massive data growth. And what we want to be is partners hand in hand in helping them to scale their data storage needs. That includes computation and storage. So we hope to have recurring revenue with them year on year by having a good, a sort of a strategic partnership that allows them to get systems as they need it. Just like getting candy whenever they have to have a party, it's basically dropped on their doorstep, and they can consume it as they need it.
Excellent. Well, those long-term relationships are critical for building a business to get that revenue ramp. And 2022 is a very important year because this is when I think you really scale up on the revenue side. Tell us a little bit about what you're planning to do this year to start commercializing and growing the technology, and what kind of capital investments you're planning for the business.
Well, we have already customers interested. So the customers interested are just the ones I mentioned. We have the major particle physics lab research. We have a couple of universities. We have National Center for Atmospheric Research, other models. We also have some defense industry contracts that are interested in already signed us with us sort of MOUs to explore further in our technology. And what we want to do this year in particular is to be able to deliver some of the very high-end systems that we have already working in the lab as alpha products, and we want to be able to now develop them and commercialize them. So this is the commercialization phase that we're going through, which is obtaining certifications and building the larger scale systems. And that's our objective this year, with about $2 million in funding that we will obtain through convertible note or safe notes. And then at the end of this year, 2022 is coming up, we will raise another $10 million to scale the production and using contract manufacturers. So contract manufacturers are basically in Europe, in North America, and they'll build these systems end to end to deliver to the customer, so that we don't need to maintain any kind of warehousing. It's kind of like a drop shipping model.
Fantastic. And this is the kind of business where I imagine there's a lot of ways of financing it. So it's not just equity capital, but it's quite capital efficient. Tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about that picture as well.
Okay, so we have been capital efficient to date. Actually, we've been, and the way we have been able to do that is by realizing that there's a lot of cost savings we can do by building systems are by ourselves. And but as we grow, what we can realize is that there's a factoring model, for instance, that enable us to once we have contracts or invoices, purchase orders, we can take them to organizations that'll give us the cash to build that product, get it to the customer, and then continue to grow like that.
And as you sort of go through this growth phase in the next year, what are you thinking of in terms of your footprint geographically? Because you're based in Switzerland, you have other operating companies set up in different parts of the world. How are you thinking about that footprint evolving as you become a global business?
We are already setting up a shop in the US because there was a big interest in what we were working on. When we went to Silicon Valley and presented there, we were immediately generated a lot of interest from investors and the customers in particular. And so our first market would be Europe and North America, and we're scaling in these two regions. And then gradually we'll look at other emerging areas like Middle East. There's already an interest from one of the companies that we talked to in California to help emerging markets build their data sovereignty through our technology, because they need very simple and energy efficient systems to be able to operate in these emerging markets because of lack of infrastructure. And so we, over time, I think over 2-3 years, we'll start scaling out to other regional markets. But we want to be able to build in that regional market as well. So as long as the capacity or capability is there, that'll allow us to be, enable us to build locally to serve the local markets, regional markets.
And so the $2 million that you're raising now, what will be the major use of that capital? And what would you anticipate using the $10 million for, in a year's time if things go well?
Well, the $2 million will allow us to build the large system to deliver to the first two customers that we have already interested in the technology. And it allow us to get the field team ready for sales and marketing. That's important because at the moment we have a very small team that does sales and marketing, but we want to be able to expand their capabilities. And but by delivering that first two systems, we'll be able to generate about $10 million in revenue. The $10 million allows us to go to these contract manufacturers that we've already been in discussions with in Germany, for instance, and the US, and then get the systems onto their production production queues to be able to then scale out the production as we meet the demand for the 200 customers that we want to target in the next 5 years.
So you'll be growing your organization quite swiftly in this period. So where are you right now as a team, as a company, and what kind of headcount growth are you going to be expecting, and in what kind of areas?
Yeah, and I think one of the great things about today is that you can build organizations across the world in a very distributed way, and they can all work together seamlessly. And we are doing that very well already in our model. We have a team in Canada that does a lot of R&D. We have a sales team that's basically in Belgium, and we have sort of a corporate team here in Switzerland. But we're now also building out a sales and research team in the US on the East Coast. And that's the first steps that we've taken there. So I think our headcount is 10 right now. We hope to be about double that by the end of this 2022. And delivering the first systems, I think and maintaining capital efficiency means that you can contract out some things. You can bring in experts to work on certain aspects of the development that's needed. But the core team remains about 10 at the moment.
That is incredibly lean. So, this all leads to the capital efficient model that you have. So in terms of revenues, what are you expecting to achieve at the end of 2022? And what's the outlook for a year or two out from there as well?
So that's a good question. We have, with the sales that we have projected, we should get about 10 million in revenue or on our books by the end of 2022. And that's targeting 10 customers that have already expressed interest in getting 2 to land in the sales, for instance. And then years after that, if you scale that, take the 20 customers who expressed interest and maybe they're buying in 2023 as their cycles come along, we're looking at about 60 million in revenue in 2023. And then it goes up from there because we have about 200 customers that we were targeting over 5 years of growth. Remember, 200 customers are not a lot for a sales team of like 10 or 20 to actually target. And their year on year, their data is growing, so they need more data storage, and they're replacing old existing systems. So then they can replace it with our systems. And so we should be able to get a 1 billion in revenue by 2027. That's our target.
Well, good. That's 5 years or just over 5 years to unicorn status, at least in revenues from valuation standpoint, perhaps even sooner. So that's a fantastic ramp. And I love the model of not just growing the number of customers, but just increasing the amount of business you do with them year on year. It's a real strong penetration that you're going to get, I think, especially with a very interesting segment of customers that are high security, often quite leading, if not bleeding edge in terms of the way they use the data. So very interesting model and, lots to look forward to.
Well, thank you. And I'm also excited about next year's growth potential as well. And of course, we wouldn't be able to do it without the community that supports us. And I'm really grateful for all the people that have given us support. I'm talking about the Swiss government, for instance, that's given us a lot of support in terms of building models and getting expert mentors for us. European Commission, which gives us lots of support. Every year, for instance, they recognize the technology we're building. They brought in a commission called the Greenhouse Gas Commission and connected us with we found a wonderful partner in Sweden and also Austria, where we can now build for zero waste technologies for data storage, I'm really, really excited about this. It was always on our mind, how can we build a full circular economy model for data storage? But there's always some lingering problems. The printed circuit boards, for instance, are very difficult to recycle. You can only extract a certain amount of things out of it. And here with this collaboration now we can now build towards a zero waste model for data storage systems. This will be really revolutionary.
And this only underlines the incredible ESG and impact value proposition that you have. It's beyond energy efficiency, but you're heading for full, circularity, the least possible environmental footprint, which in this business, which uses so much, in terms of precious metals and this footprint beyond the heat, that's going to be really important and probably a very important differentiator.
Correct. One of the things that we must recognize early on is that when you're using 3% of the world's energy just to run data systems around the world, which is what the case is right now, that's more than what Germany consumes, more than what Japan consumes. And then you realize that, what the carbon footprint for energy is, well, that's 3.7% of the global emissions are due just to data for carbon emissions. And that's more than the airline industry. Everybody focuses on the airline industry, but they don't realize that our habits of data, just by clicking on things and sharing videos, etc., consumes a lot of energy and thus emits a lot of carbon.
Over the past 20 years, I've worked with hundreds of entrepreneurs to build impact unicorns. In my experience, every company that has a transformative positive effect on the world does so by building strong partnerships with communities, investors, and governments to solve society's biggest challenges. If you'd like to learn more about how innovative entrepreneurs can help to build a more sustainable and inclusive future, read my award-winning book, Powering Prosperity, A Citizen's Guide to Shaping the 21st Century.
You mentioned a statistic to me once, which is that if you send an email with an attachment, that's the equivalent carbon footprint of a small plastic bag. Is that true?
Yes. In fact, BBC highlighted that to me on an interesting article. That is that, when you send an email, it has to go through a network. It has to be processed by something and then stored. And that takes energy. And that energy equivalent is basically the amount that you need to produce a single plastic bag. And the corollary to that is we use 100,000 plastic bags per second around the world, but we send 3.5 million emails per second around the world. So it's really out of whack there.
Well, I don't think we're going to be sending any fewer emails or clicking any less on social media. But I think what you're doing with this orders of magnitude improvement on space and energy efficiency is going to make a huge contribution, not to mention a great business. So, Bhupinder, thanks very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Best of luck to you for 2022. I think it's going to be a breakout year. And come tell us about it in a year's time and tell us where you are and all your achievements at that time.
And also, thank you, Indranil. That's been wonderful talking to you. And I wish you also, we are recording at the end of the year. I wish you a happy new year to you and your listeners. And I would be delighted to come back and tell you about our progress.
Fabulous. Take care. Have a great year.
Okay, thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Impact Unicorns, don't forget to rate and review this show by scrolling down and clicking Rate This Podcast. And join me next week as I talk to more inspirational entrepreneurs building the next generation of transformative companies.